Right now, inside thousands of beginner beehives, there's a tiny red parasite the size of a pinhead, riding on a bee's back, quietly injecting viruses into the colony. And here's the part nobody warned you about. The hive can look completely fine, bees flying, honey building up, everything humming along, while it's already too late to save it. Picture two bees side by side on the same frame. One has full glassy wings, flying strong, doing its job. The other has small, crumpled, useless wings, unable to leave the hive, dragging itself weakly across the comb. That second bee is showing you the end result of a process that actually started weeks earlier, back when it was still a developing larva sealed inside its cell, and a mite was already feeding on it. By the time you can see the damage with your own eyes, the decision that caused it was already made in the past. That's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this entire mistake. The moment you notice a problem is almost never the moment the problem started. If you're new to beekeeping and you want your first hive to actually survive its first winter, hit subscribe, because every week I break down the exact mistakes that quietly wipe out beginner colonies before they become disasters you can't undo. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what this mistake is, why it's so easy to make without realizing it, and, more importantly, the exact 3-step check you can do this weekend to find out if your hive is already in trouble. This isn't theory. This is the single failure point that beekeeping mentors see over and over in first-year colonies, and it's almost always preventable if you catch it early enough. Here's what almost nobody tells new beekeepers. The mistake that kills the most first-year hives isn't a dramatic one. It's not knocking over a hive box or getting the smoker technique wrong. It's something quieter. It's simply not checking for varroa mites early enough, and not treating when the numbers say you should. That sounds almost too simple to be the big mistake, right? But here's the problem. Varroa destructor doesn't announce itself. A mite infestation can sit at a low, seemingly harmless level all summer, and the hive will look completely normal. Bees will forage, the queen will lay, you might even pull a modest honey harvest. Meanwhile, the mite population is doubling roughly every month during the height of the brood-rearing season. Think about it like this. Imagine a city where a slow-spreading illness is passing through the population, but nobody's tracking case numbers. Everything looks fine, traffic's flowing, shops are open, right up until the hospitals are suddenly overwhelmed all at once. That's a varroa infestation in a nutshell. The visible symptoms don't show up gradually. They show up in a cascade, usually in late summer or early fall, right when the colony can least afford it. Here's the part that catches beginners off guard. Mites don't just weaken bees by feeding on them. They're a vector for viruses, most notably deformed wing virus. A hive with a low mite count might have almost no visible virus symptoms. But once mite levels cross a certain threshold, viral loads inside the colony can spike dramatically. And that's when you start seeing bees crawling near the entrance with shriveled, useless wings, unable to fly. And here's the twist that makes this the silent mistake. By the time you see those symptoms, the damage to that generation of winter bees is already done. Deformed wing virus doesn't just affect the bees showing symptoms. It's an indicator that a much larger portion of the developing brood has been affected internally, even in bees that look perfectly normal from the outside. New beekeepers often make one specific assumption that gets them in trouble. They assume that because their hive came from a reputable supplier, or because wild bees managed fine for millions of years, their hive doesn't need mite monitoring. But that assumption doesn't hold up anymore. Varroa destructor jumped from the Asian honeybee to the European honeybee species that most backyard beekeepers keep, and Western honeybees never evolved strong natural defenses against it. Without a resistant genetic background or active management, colonies simply don't have the tools to keep mite populations in check on their own. There's a specific number that makes this timing problem concrete. A worker bee brood cell stays capped for about 12 days, but a drone brood cell stays capped for roughly 14 to 15 days. Those extra 2 to 3 days might not sound like much, but for a mite reproducing inside that cell, it's enough time to raise an additional offspring or 2 per cycle. Multiply that across hundreds of drone cells in a healthy, well-fed colony during peak summer, and you can see how quickly the math turns against a beekeeper who isn't tracking it. Mites don't just feed on adult bees. Their primary reproduction happens inside capped brood cells, particularly drone brood, which stays capped a few days longer than worker brood, giving mites more time to reproduce. That means a colony that's raising a lot of drones in midsummer, which healthy, thriving colonies naturally do, can unintentionally become a mite-breeding factory at exactly the moment the beekeeper feels most confident that everything is going well. It's a strange, almost cruel irony. The very signs of a strong, productive colony, lots of brood, lots of drones, a prolific queen, are the same conditions that let mite populations explode fastest. And here's a mistake within the mistake that trips up even attentive beginners, assuming that because they don't see mites crawling on bees during a routine inspection, the hive must be mite-free. Adult mites spend the vast majority of their lives inside capped brood cells, hidden from view, only emerging onto adult bees briefly between reproductive cycles. So a quick visual scan of bees walking across a frame will almost always underestimate the true mite load, sometimes dramatically. This is exactly why an actual wash or roll test matters so much more than eyeballing it. Visual inspection alone gives you a false sense of security precisely when you need clear information the most. Now here's where it gets interesting, and where most beginner beekeepers get blindsided. The most dangerous window for this mistake isn't spring, when everyone's paying close attention to their new colony. It's late summer, usually August into September, depending on your climate.
Here's why that timing matters so much. In late summer, the colony starts raising a very specific generation of bees, the ones beekeepers call winter bees or diutinous bees. These bees are physiologically different from the workers raised in spring and summer. They have larger, fat bodies. They live for months instead of weeks, and their entire job is to keep the cluster alive through the cold months by generating heat and caring for the queen. If varroa mite levels are high during exactly this window, right when those winter bees are being raised in the brood cells, the mites feed on the developing bees and transmit viruses at the worst possible moment. You end up with a generation of winter bees that are physically weaker, shorter-lived, and less capable of clustering effectively through the cold. And because these are the only bees the colony has to survive winter, there's no more brood being raised to replace them. A compromised winter generation is often a death sentence for the whole colony, even if that colony looked completely healthy back in July. Here's a scenario that plays out constantly in beekeeping forums and mentor programs. A first-year beekeeper checks their hive in July, sees bees everywhere, a laying queen, and capped honey. They think, "This hive is doing great. I don't need to mess with it." They don't do a mite check. Fall comes, the hive still looks reasonably active into September. Then October hits, temperatures drop, and within a few weeks that beekeeper opens the hive to find a small, weak cluster, or worse, no bees at all. Just a box full of honey and a few dead bees on the bottom board. That's not bad luck. That's untreated varroa combined with a compromised winter generation, and it's one of the most common stories mentors hear every single spring when beginners come back asking, "What did I do wrong?" There's a physical difference you can sometimes even notice by hand if you know what you're looking for. Diutinous winter bees carry noticeably larger fat bodies inside their abdomens than summer bees, packed with protein and vitellogenin reserves that let them survive for months rather than the usual 4 to 6 weeks a summer worker lives. A virus-compromised winter bee simply can't build those reserves properly, no matter how much pollen and syrup is available in the hive. So even a colony sitting on plenty of stored food can still starve or freeze because the individual bees making up the cluster were never physically capable of doing their job through the cold months. And it's arguably more heartbreaking because the beekeeper did almost everything right. Imagine someone who checked their hive weekly all summer, kept a hive journal, fed syrup when needed, and even added a second brood box when the colony expanded. By every visible measure, they were an attentive, responsible first-year beekeeper. But they never once pulled a mite sample, because nobody told them that attentiveness to the things you can see doesn't protect you from the thing you can't. Come November, that same diligent beekeeper opens the hive to a dead-out, the technical term for a hive that didn't make it. And the honestly devastating part is they did almost everything else right. That's exactly why this mistake is singled out as the mistake, instead of getting lumped in with a dozen other beginner errors. It's the one that can undo an otherwise well-managed hive.
There's also a seasonal wrinkle worth understanding here, because it explains why so much advice online feels contradictory. In warmer climates, with longer brood-rearing seasons, colonies may raise several rounds of brood well into fall, which means the winter bee window can stretch out and shift later in the year. In colder climates, that window closes earlier, sometimes as soon as late July or early August. This is part of why a one-size-fits-all calendar doesn't work. What matters isn't a specific date on a calendar. It's tracking when your particular colony, in your particular climate, starts shifting toward raising its final generation before the cold sets in. Local beekeeping associations and agricultural extension offices are usually the best source for that regional timing, and it's worth checking in with one early in your first season rather than guessing. Stick around because coming up, I'm going to show you the specific field test that takes less than 10 minutes and tells you exactly where your hive stands. Because this is the mistake that quietly ends more first-year hives than every other beginner mistake combined. So here's the actual fix, and it's simpler than most beginners expect. The most reliable, low-cost way to know your real mite level is called an alcohol wash or a sugar roll. Both methods involve taking a sample of about 300 bees, roughly a half-cup scoop from a frame with open brood, and either shaking them in alcohol or powdered sugar to dislodge the mites so you can count how many fall off. I know what you might be thinking. That sounds harsh, especially the alcohol wash, since it does sacrifice that sample of bees. And that's a completely fair concern for a beginner who wants to protect every single bee in a young colony. But here's the trade-off you have to weigh. Sacrificing roughly 300 bees to get an accurate count is a tiny cost compared to potentially losing the entire colony of 30 or 40,000 bees because you didn't know your mite level was already dangerous. Once you have your count, here's roughly how to read it. If you're finding somewhere around 1 to 2 mites per 100 bees, you're generally in a manageable range, especially outside of peak brood season. If you're seeing 3 or more mites per 100 bees, most current guidance suggests it's time to treat. And if you're well above that, some beekeepers report counts of 10, 15, even higher per 100 bees in badly infested colonies. That hive is in serious, immediate danger, regardless of how active it looks from the outside. Now, here's the part that separates beekeepers who keep their hives alive from those who don't. Testing is only half of the equation. The other half is being willing to actually treat when the numbers say you should, even if the hive still looks perfectly healthy. This is the psychological trap that catches so many caring, well-intentioned beginners. It feels wrong to medicate a hive that seems fine. But treating based on an actual mite count, rather than on how the colony looks, is exactly the shift in thinking that separates a colony that survives winter from one that doesn't. There are several treatment options available depending on your climate and the time of year. Things like formic acid-based treatments, oxalic acid, or thymol-based products, each with different temperature requirements and timing windows. The specific product matters less than the core habit. Test, and then act on what the test tells you, instead of acting on how the hive appears. Here's an analogy that tends to stick with people. Think of mite testing like checking your smoke detector's battery. You don't wait for smoke to fill the room before you check if the battery works. You check it on a schedule, regardless of whether anything seems wrong. Mite testing works the same way. You check on a schedule. Many experienced beekeepers test roughly monthly during the growing season, and especially in that critical late summer window, regardless of how calm and productive the hive looks on any given day. There's also a common question about what to do with the bees afterward. With the sugar roll, once you've shaken the mites free onto your white surface, you simply return the sugared bees to the hive entrance, and they'll groom the sugar off themselves and each other within an hour or so, which, as a side benefit, actually helps knock loose a few more mites during that grooming.
With the alcohol wash, the sample bees don't survive the process, which is the honest trade-off of getting a slightly more accurate count, since alcohol dislodges essentially all the mites present, rather than the roughly 90% or so that a sugar roll typically catches. For a colony that's already fairly strong, sacrificing 300 bees out of 30 or 40,000 is a small cost. For a very small or newly established colony, some beekeepers lean toward the sugar roll specifically to avoid that loss, accepting a slightly less precise number in exchange for keeping every bee in a fragile young hive. Let's walk through what the actual process looks like, step by step, because a lot of beginners get intimidated by the idea before they've even tried it. You'll want a mason jar with a mesh or hardware cloth lid, some rubbing alcohol or windshield washer fluid for a wash, or powdered sugar for the gentler roll method, a white plate or tray for counting, and a half-cup measuring scoop. Open the hive, find a frame with open, uncapped brood. That's important because that's where nurse bees cluster, and nurse bees tend to carry a higher, more representative mite load. Give the frame a firm shake over an open container to dislodge bees. Then scoop roughly a half cup, which works out to somewhere around 300 bees, into your jar. For the alcohol method, add enough alcohol to cover the bees, seal the lid, and swirl vigorously for about a minute. The mites detach and fall through the mesh, and you count them on the plate below. For the sugar roll, coat the bees in a few tablespoons of powdered sugar. Let the jar sit for a couple of minutes, then shake vigorously over a white surface. The sugar makes the mites lose their grip without harming the bees, so you can return them to the hive afterward. One thing worth addressing directly, because it comes up constantly in beginner forums: what do you do with a borderline number? Say your wash comes back at exactly 2 mites per 100 bees, right in that gray zone between probably fine and should treat. Here's the practical answer. Context matters as much as the raw number. If you're testing in June, with months of brood rearing still ahead, a borderline count gives you room to retest in a few weeks and watch the trend. But if that same borderline number shows up in late July or August, right as your colony is about to raise its winter bees, the safer choice is almost always to treat rather than wait. Because the cost of treating a colony that maybe didn't strictly need it yet is low, while the cost of waiting through the wrong window is potentially catastrophic. When in doubt, in that late summer window specifically, treat. But here's where it gets even more layered, because Varroa mismanagement rarely happens in isolation. It usually compounds with 2 or 3 other beginner habits that make the whole situation worse. The first is treating too late in the season. Some treatments need daytime temperatures within a specific range to be both effective and safe for the bees, and by the time a beginner notices visible symptoms, like those bees with deformed wings, it's often already late September or October in many regions, and the temperature window for certain treatments may have already closed. That's why the 10-minute test earlier in the season matters so much. It gives you options that a visual inspection alone doesn't. The second compounding mistake is what beekeepers sometimes call treatment theater, going through the motions of treating without actually verifying the mite count came down afterward. A beginner treats once, feels reassured, and moves on, without ever doing a follow-up wash to confirm the treatment actually worked. Different treatments have different efficacy rates, and if the first round doesn't bring counts down far enough, an untested assumption of success can be just as dangerous as never treating at all. And the third compounding mistake, this one surprises a lot of people, is mite bombs from robbing behavior. Late in the season, when nectar sources dry up, colonies with weaker populations sometimes get robbed by stronger neighboring colonies, or even other hives in the same apiary. If that weak, heavily infested colony gets robbed, the mites can hitch a ride home with the robbing bees, effectively reinfesting a hive that had just been treated. This is exactly why testing isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing habit through the whole growing season, especially if there are other hives, feral colonies, or neighboring apiaries nearby. Here's a real pattern that shows up again and again in beekeeping mentorship groups. A beginner treats their hive once in early August, feels like they've done the mite thing, and doesn't check again. In October, that same hive collapses, not because the first treatment failed outright, but because a nearby weak, untreated colony got robbed out in September, and the mites came home with the robbers. The beginner did one thing right and still lost the hive, because the mistake wasn't a single event. It was treating mite management as a checkbox instead of an ongoing rhythm. One habit that helps enormously here, and costs almost nothing to start, is simply writing your mite counts down every time you test, in a small notebook or a phone note, date, count, and what you did about it. A single number on its own tells you very little, but 3 or 4 numbers over a season show you a trend line, and trend lines are what actually let you catch a problem before it becomes a crisis. A count that jumps from 1 mite per 100 bees in June to 4 per 100 bees in late July is telling you something urgent, even if 4 still sounds like a small number on its own.
Because just treat isn't especially useful advice without some context on what's actually available. Broadly, treatments fall into a few families. There are organic acid treatments. Formic acid and oxalic acid are the most common, which work by disrupting mite reproduction and, in the case of oxalic acid, are particularly effective when a colony has little to no capped brood, since oxalic acid doesn't penetrate the wax cappings well. That's actually why oxalic acid is often used in late fall or early winter, once brood rearing has mostly stopped, or as a broodless period treatment in regions with a hard winter. Formic acid, by contrast, can penetrate capped brood, which makes it effective during the growing season, but it requires daytime temperatures to stay within a specific range, generally not too hot and not too cold, both for effectiveness and to avoid harming the queen or brood. Then there are thymol-based treatments, an essential oil derivative, which tend to work more slowly and are also temperature sensitive, generally needing warmer weather to vaporize effectively. And finally, there are synthetic miticides, which can be highly effective, but come with their own considerations around resistance buildup in mite populations if overused. The point of walking through all of this isn't to turn you into a chemist overnight. It's to make one thing clear: the right treatment depends on your season, your climate, and your colony's current brood status. Which is exactly why just Google a treatment and apply it often backfires for beginners. A treatment that works beautifully in October in a cold climate can be the wrong choice entirely in July in a warm one. This is genuinely one of the areas where a quick conversation with a local beekeeping association or extension office pays for itself many times over, because they know the treatment windows that actually apply to your specific region. Here's one more scenario worth sitting with, because it illustrates the robbing risk especially well. Picture a small backyard apiary with 3 hives close together, a common beginner setup, since it's efficient to manage a few hives in one spot. Hive A is strong and well managed. Hive B is a struggling swarm-caught colony with a poor queen and a heavy mite load that the beekeeper hasn't gotten around to testing yet. In late August, as nectar flow dries up, Hive B becomes an easy target, and bees from Hive A, and possibly from a neighbor's yard too, start robbing out Hive B's honey stores. Within days, Hive B is stripped and collapses. But here's the part that catches beginners off guard. Those robbing bees don't just take honey home, they can carry mites back to Hive A along with it. Weeks later, the beekeeper is confused about why their strong hive is suddenly struggling too, without realizing the weak hive right next to it was effectively a mite reservoir that got emptied straight into the healthy one. Let's put this into something you can actually act on this week. In the growing season, a simple rhythm looks like this. Test roughly every 3 to 4 weeks, starting in late spring. Test again as soon as you notice a shift toward late summer in your area, and always retest about 2 to 3 weeks after any treatment to confirm the numbers actually came down rather than assuming they did. If you keep just that one rhythm, you've already put yourself ahead of a large share of first-year beekeepers. Because the single biggest gap isn't knowledge, it's consistency. Plenty of beginners know mites exist. Very few actually test on the schedule they stick to. It's worth saying plainly that none of this requires expensive equipment or years of experience. A jar, some powdered sugar or alcohol, a white plate, and about 10 minutes of your time is genuinely the entire barrier between guessing and knowing.
The beekeepers who lose their first hive to this mistake almost never lack the tools. They lack the habit, usually because nobody framed it as urgent until it was too late. So here's the answer to the question this whole video opened with. Why can a hive that looks completely fine collapse seemingly overnight? It's not overnight at all. It's the result of a slow, invisible mite buildup through the summer, compounding with delayed testing, delayed treatment, and the false confidence that comes from watching a hive that still looks active on the surface. And here's the single most valuable thing to take away from everything we've covered. The health of your winter bees is decided in late summer, not in winter itself. By the time cold weather arrives and a colony starts to struggle, the outcome was already largely determined weeks or months earlier, based on the mite load during that critical brood-rearing window. If there's one habit that separates beginners who keep their first hive alive from the roughly 40% who don't, it's this: testing for mites on a schedule, treating based on actual numbers rather than appearances, and confirming with a follow-up test that treatment actually worked. Let's lock in the big three takeaways. 1. A healthy-looking hive can still be in serious trouble. Looks are not a mite test. 2. Late summer is the danger zone, because that's when your winter bees are raised, and it's the worst possible time for high mite loads. 3. Test on a schedule, treat based on numbers, and always follow up to confirm the treatment actually worked. Master that rhythm, and you've just eliminated the single biggest threat to your first-year colony. So here's my question for you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever done a mite count on your hive, or has this been the piece you didn't know you were missing? I'd genuinely like to know where you're starting from, because it helps me figure out what to cover next. If this helped you, the next video you'll want is the one where I walk through exactly how to read your alcohol wash results and match them to the right treatment for your climate and season. Because knowing your numbers is only useful if you know what to do with them. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and hit the notification bell if you want it the moment it goes up. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we wrap up. Every experienced beekeeper you'll ever talk to has a story about a hive they lost in their first year or two. Almost always for a reason that feels obvious in hindsight, but wasn't obvious at the time. That's not a reason to feel discouraged if this is your first season. It's actually the opposite. The information that took most beekeepers a hard, expensive lesson to learn, you just got handed for free before you needed it. The gap between the beekeepers who keep hives alive year after year and the ones who quit after a rough first winter usually isn't talent, and it isn't luck. It's simply whether they built the habit of checking the thing they couldn't see instead of only trusting the things they could. At the end of the day, keeping bees alive isn't about being perfect. It's about paying attention at the moments that matter most. And there's something quietly beautiful about that. A colony of 40,000 bees working together as one living organism, surviving a whole winter on the decisions you made back in August. That's not just beekeeping. That's stewardship. And it's worth doing right.